Hello, and thank you so much for joining this next podcast episode. I'm Erin McCann. I'm the founder and CEO of C+B, and I've been amazed at the response to the first podcast episode focused on my experiences with sexual harassment and being silenced. So, podcast episode is intended as a follow up to provide a bit more detail on the effects of those experiences. So often, when we talk about sexual harassment, we focus on the particular incident that occurred, who was involved, how it transpired. And we don't always talk about what happens next. And in my experience, there were certainly challenges involved with the experience of being sexually harassed, as I mentioned in the first podcast episode. And things changed in very real ways for me across a variety of different aspects of my life. So I wanted to spend today talking a bit about those in the hopes that this helps others feel safe, or at least safer, in sharing their experiences, in sharing thoughts and reflections, and hopefully feeling seen and heard through me talking a bit about my experiences. As a quick recap, the events that I discussed occurred in 2012. So we are picking back up in 2012. Essentially, I had mentioned in the first podcast episode that I had spent about a 2-month period of time at the backplane, which resulted in me being sexually harassed and signing a non disclosure agreement, not because I was interested in money, but because the alternative would have been perceived as me taking one or more members of the company to court. And one thing I failed to mention in the last podcast episode is I talked a bit about some documents that I had been reviewing very recently and wanted to acknowledge that the reason I still had those documents up until about a month ago was based on legal counsel. I was advised to retain copies of any documentation related to the incidents as well as other aspects of my employment, and essentially retain copies of any communication throughout that 2-month period. So that was the reason those documents were still in my possession. I'm happy to say that as part of my move, they are no longer in my possession. And really appreciate the opportunity to talk about what happened next. In the first podcast episode, I also mentioned that I was grateful to relatively quickly find a new role at Twitter. And I appreciated my time at Twitter and I learned a lot there. And I also want to start at that inflection point because things were already changing for me. As I mentioned, I was already struggling with depression. I was having difficulty even getting out of bed for about a week after I signed the non disclosure agreement and effectively silenced my ability to talk about what happened. All I could really say as I was navigating potential job prospects was that there was a deep misalignment of values, which didn't give me much to acknowledge what had really occurred, left a lot of room for interpretation, and continued to bring the events that had transpired to the forefront of every conversation I was having about employment. And what changed for me involved a few different aspects of the way I looked at work, the way I engaged with others, the way I showed up, the way I prioritized my time, and the way I was living. So, first and foremost, while I was very grateful for the role I had at Twitter, the role that I accepted looked much more like the work I had done before going to Harvard Business School than the kind of role I had intended and had been interviewing for and had been receiving job offers for before and following graduation. And what I mean by that is I began to prioritize very different things. And for me, the single most important priority at that time was working with people that I knew to do everything I possibly could to be confident that I would not be sexually harassed again. So the types of jobs I was looking at, the types of responsibilities I was examining, my frame of reference had changed dramatically. And while I was grateful for that role, it did not have the level of leadership that I had anticipated having in my first position after graduating from Harvard Business School. It was a very different role than the types of roles I had been interviewing for. And I had mixed feelings about that because I had worked very hard in business school to chart my next steps and to chart my path forward. I was grateful to be able to re engage with people that I had trusted and learned from at Google and in other experiences throughout my time at HBS. And I was grateful to get into work rapidly, given that there were very real financial considerations as well. But the work that I set out to do and the work I ended up doing were quite different. And that was one very big change. Another very big change was how I engaged with people. I used to be someone that not only attended, but planned social events. I was very focused on getting to know people and understanding what motivated them and finding common ground. And now I began to look at people as liabilities, not because I assumed that I was going to be sexually harassed again, but I began to look at any sharing of personal details whatsoever as unnecessary and a liability. And so instead of engaging with people and openly sharing about me and my hobbies and my interests and my experiences had been, in part because I was silenced and couldn't talk about the work I had done immediately prior to any real degree, but also because I was now grappling with self-doubt and questions about what role, if any, I had played in what happened to me, which I know confidently, having done the work over the past 10 plus years, was not a question I should have been asking myself, but at the time, I was certainly questioning myself on a variety of different levels. And how could I prevent this from happening again? And the solution I came to was to armor up, keep my distance, give people only as much information as I felt they needed in any given circumstance, let people talk openly about themselves, but to share very little about myself. The reality is, when someone engages with us in a closed off way, in a way that suggests they're suspicious of us, naturally, many of us will respond in a similar way. So I was engaging with the world in a very different way, and I was seeing that reflected back at me as well. And how I viewed the world changed too. When it came to the key areas of focus in my day to day, I mentioned I looked at work very differently and I looked at engaging with people very differently. You might wonder what else is left. I became more attuned to negative events around the world. And working at Twitter, you could look at that type of content all day with a handful of hashtags and selecting certain accounts to follow and really be inundated with tragedy and natural disasters and conflict throughout the workday. And this was not the only area where I was not placing boundaries around my time, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. But this was something that I realized in hindsight, I needed to do a better job of putting time bounds around this type of information. It began to have effects on me. I began to experience depressive like effects from looking at that content for hours a day. And when I've written about my challenges with social media and taking several years away from social media in the sense that I stepped back and read others' posts, but didn't contribute to the conversation for a long time. Many people immediately hear that and think I'm talking about jealousy and about comparative dynamics, particularly with women, but also with men. And while I'm sure that happened from time to time, when it comes to seeing something and feeling less than or feeling like we need to accomplish more, we haven't yet achieved our goals. Certainly, I was feeling that in terms of how things had gone in the job I had worked hard to get. I was feeling like I hadn't accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. So I was very attuned to career success. But when it came to other aspects of social media, it really was not about jealousy. It was not about wanting to be an influencer or have a certain following or have a certain presence or position. It was about looking at tragedy and conflict for a substantial portion of most days of the week. And that began to affect me. When it came to other aspects of how this played out, as I mentioned, I used to be somebody that not only attended social events, but organized them. And instead, I was not prioritizing any type of engagement with the team or the organization from a social and activity perspective. And I was throwing myself into work with my clients really as the priority. So when we talk about throwing ourselves into work, what we often talk about is blocking out other parts of our life, things that may be difficult to deal with, and instead focusing on the task at hand. And that can be productive. There can be positive benefits to that. And it certainly was productive for me. Given the timing of when I joined the team, it took some time to show that. But within the year, I was among the top performers when it came to key metrics like revenue and other types of client engagement. In my definition of throwing myself into work, I wasn't prioritizing the team side of things. So within that year period, I was someone people might know the name of on things like team reports or leaderboards or other metrics focused pieces of communication. Most people didn't know me much at all. And what they did know, as I mentioned, was someone who presented as not sharing much of herself, possibly seeming like she didn't trust others or was suspicious of others, and certainly someone that kept her distant. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge the time frame here and to affirm yet again that I am someone who lives with disability level anxiety and OCD. And I was not all that aware of either at the time. I knew I had certain OCD like tendencies that were surging due to my heightened anxiety from signing the non disclosure agreement and the events that had occurred and continued to occur when it came to not being able to talk about my experiences. But many of the things I was doing in terms of optimizing the workday for myself were simply out of instinct. I now understand that they had much to do with being a highly sensitive person, sensitive to things like bright lighting, who struggled with the very popular work setup at the time, which often involved long tables of individuals seated immediately to the right and left of each other, all taking calls at the same time. I found this experience tremendously overwhelming. And so I would go to quiet rooms to make my call. And that allowed me to think, process, to dim the lighting, and get things done. And it proved very effective in terms of those results, as I mentioned. And it further isolated me from the team. Now, I'm pleased to see that over time, there have been greater questions around that type of work setup. And I hope this continues. Am I saying that everyone that identifies with either a disability or as someone who is neurodivergent has these types of challenges? No. I think we've come to learn over time that environment, level of noise, type of lighting, the inability to hear oneself even say words out loud in some cases because so many calls are happening at the same time can be quite challenging for people in general, and particularly for me and perhaps for others who experience anxiety, consider themselves neurodivergent and or sensitive. So all of these things were playing a role, and I became someone that really looked at anything other than activities that would directly contribute to the bottom line and metrics as not priority. And it was never about the money. It was about needing to prove to myself that I was still capable of achieving, having looked at what happened at the backplane as a tremendous failure from multiple vantage points and being unable to talk about that in any real way. I needed the numbers. I needed concrete proof that I was capable, that I was effective, that I could create real value for my clients in an ethical, honest way. And I did that. And I lived by my values and prove my worth to the team. So while I wasn't investing in conversations and relationships, I was contributing strongly to revenue. So from that perspective, I was supporting my team. But when it came to things like getting to know others who might have been a mentor to me, engaging with other teams, bonding with people outside of the workday, those were not priorities at that point. I was working around the clock because I was not putting boundaries around my own time. So I was very quickly becoming resentful of the fact that I wasn't getting enough sleep, that I wasn't able to even get home before dark many days because of the timing and the logistics involved in getting to and from the office. And I wasn't investing in people. So I wasn't having the opportunity to get to know people and feeling of camaraderie and mentorship. I was working night and day for metrics because I needed the proof of my own ability to succeed. Now, this continued throughout the December holidays and was a pattern that I struggled with throughout my time in that role, as well as into the future, which I'll talk more about in future podcast conversations. I want to talk a bit about the positives as well. And I'm not only referring to looking at this as an example of personal resilience or ability to create positive impact in a measurable way for the team. I kicked off this conversation asking the question to myself of what changed. And the reality was I changed it in many ways. Some of those were not as positive, particularly in terms of how I viewed people and sharing of myself as a liability. But I grew in several ways as well. And I share this only to help those that have had any type of experience that aligns with anything that I've said, any type of experience for whom this conversation is resonating, to help them be able to dig deeper into how they grew out of that experience. So I got better in several ways over time These were not instantaneous changes, but over time, I got better in several ways. First of all, I read and I learned. I was always someone that engaged deeply in coursework. I cared deeply about grades, but I also cared deeply about learning throughout school. And now I started digging into reading about subjects that I hadn't understood. I read and I learned about human behavior, human nature, power, psychology, philosophy, and a variety of strategies that I hadn't studied before. I was grateful to be with a partner who was incredibly well read and who shared with me many books that he had found valuable in these subjects and more. And I also began my own journey of selecting material leaders, innovators to learn from, and began bridging concepts and understanding not only how to apply philosophy to life and to use philosophy as one framework, a life, but that took time. What it really helped me to start doing in reading these books and learning from these authors and thought leaders was I became very good at reading people in ways I hadn't been before. I became someone who could observe and take in what someone said and what they didn't say out loud, their facial expressions, body language, pauses, and more. I became someone who could assess inconsistencies between someone's words and their actions. I spoke a lot less and became someone who listened always. And as I mentioned, listening and providing others the opportunity to share is very positive for creating opportunities for connection. One would typically expect that would be mutual to establish connection. I was doing very little sharing, so it was not surprising to me in hindsight that people may have had perceptions of me that I didn't intend, but created by not sharing much about myself at all. Some people may have perceived that as simply drawing a very strong line between work and non-work. Other people may have other interpretations, but I have been described by some as good at observing, watching, or understanding people. And in large part, I credit that to the fact that my worldview changed. How I showed up changed. And it prompted me to recognize that there was so much I didn't know. And we can never read all the books in the world. We can never know everything. I think recognizing how little I knew was a gift. And it pushed me to recognize that I was novice in many important areas and needed to better understand people, psychology, behavior, and more. Now, why do I describe this as a positive? I think we have to be able to understand human nature to first understand ourselves and certainly to understand others. Oftentimes I get the question, how did you go from working in sales and marketing and advertising to focusing on compassionate and beneficial change and sustainable, high quality lives for people, animals, and the environment? Everything I have described so far was part of that process. My lens widened. I began looking at events around the world in ways I never had before. I began listening to and understanding people in ways I never had before. And I lived through challenges I would have never expected, with being silenced as a key inflection point for me in terms of my ability to hear people and animals. And I began to long for more meaning, to long for something that gave me a different way to create positive value, to create positive change within a pretty rapid period of time. And I began thinking about whether it was time to volunteer with an animal shelter or to contribute to a nonprofit in a different way. And I'm grateful that the partner I was with at the time recognized that I found meaning before we had ever met in caring for animals and suggested that we adopt a dog, and specifically a dog that had been waiting for a home that might be less likely to get adopted. And since then, I have worked and had the opportunity to support and engage with animal shelters from a variety of different perspectives, including those that are considered no kill, and also seeking out ways to support shelters that may not have a no kill designation. What I can say at the time is that our focus was on finding a dog that might not be as desirable on his surface from his online presence in a variety of ways, and in particular, be running out of time in a shelter environment. And we chose to adopt from a county pound, and we were living in an apartment at the time. So there were factors that applied to the adoption process for my dog that didn't apply later when I was living in my own house. And that experience helped me understand some of the issues that I'm focused on now in terms of increasing availability of pet-friendly housing, in terms of the issues with breed restrictions, and more. because I lived that. And I am only grateful for the dog that we brought home. And I'm about to talk about just how much he changed not only my life, but where I find meaning and purpose in life and where I focus my time and energy. I have my dog to thank for all of that. But two things can be true. I am tremendously grateful for my dog and how he changed my life. And I am also very aware that there are a tremendous number of dogs waiting for homes that are negatively impacted by breed restrictions and other parameters that limit the availability of pet-friendly housing, particularly apartments and rentals. So I want to talk about this in future podcast episodes. I say this to emphasize that at the time I was living in an apartment. And so I understand how living in an apartment can affect one's ability to bring an animal into one's life. I was grateful that we were living in an apartment that did allow for us to adopt a dog. And I was also aware that being in an animal shelter is something I have to be very planful about, so that I am only contributing positively to the experience, both for people and animals. And what I mean by that is it can be a very emotional experience for me to take in the number of animals that are waiting for homes, to recognize that I can't possibly bring them all home with me and to cope with that emotionally. And I've talked before about how that could lead to tears because of the emotional overwhelm and the number of animals in need of homes. So in this particular instance, my then partner went to the shelter by himself, and where he was going was a county pound. And he went with the awareness that there were two dogs that had been waiting for homes for some time, and we could only bring one home. And in looking at both dogs, he realized one dog had a far greater likelihood of getting adopted based on a variety of different factors, including his breed and appearance and his shelter game, because he was very charismatic. And the other dog was not charismatic at all. And the other dog had substantial mats. He had some excess weight that would need to be managed. He had some pre-existing medical needs. He had a variety of different factors that on paper might make him less likely to get adopted. And that is the dog that came home with him and then us. And this dog already knew his name and already responded to his name. And his name was Cody. And it took a few months for Cody to get comfortable with us and for me to really learn Cody and his needs. And there were some challenges in those first few months, but within 3 months, he became so loving and affectionate and responsive in ways that I would have never expected. And I'll talk more about that in future episodes. When we talk about needing to give adoptive dogs some time to get acclimated, I lived this in a very real way. And I can say for me, it took about 3 months. And Cody changed my life in ways I could have never expected. He brought tremendous meaning and purpose to my life, particularly through caring for him and his needs. He introduced me to the world of animal welfare. He inspired me to learn more and more, to support him, to get involved with an animal shelter first as a volunteer and then as a board member, to enroll and complete a Master of Science in International Animal Welfare Ethics and Law, to adopt another special needs animal, this time a cat named Bogart. And ultimately, he and Bogart are who inspired me to found C+B, which stands for Compassionate and Beneficial Living, as well as Cody plus Bogart. Cody is the C in C+B. And he changed my life forever. And I feel confident in saying he would have never entered my life had circumstances not gone the way they did. He wouldn't have entered my life if I hadn't left the backplane, joined Twitter, had the experiences I had, found myself seeking meaning and an opportunity to contribute, particularly for animals, and ultimately becoming his pet parent. So while we started this conversation with the effects of sexual harassment and being silenced, C+B would not exist today, and I wouldn't be the person I am today without those experiences. And I hope for those who are listening and hearing elements of my experience and finding that they map or resonate to elements of their own experience, that this helps you look at your experiences in a different way, reframe them with a sense of empowerment, and help you to write your own narrative, because the stories we tell ourselves matter. How we make sense and meaning of our experiences matters. And if any of you would like to discuss your experiences with me, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Welcome any thoughts and feedback on additional topics you'd like to hear covered or questions. I encourage you to follow the podcast, to engage in whatever way you're interested. And thank you so much for listening. Thanks so much for joining this episode of the Compassionate and Beneficial Living podcast. Please follow, subscribe, share your comments, share with others, and let us know what topics you'd like to hear covered next.